And when I was at Stanford in the late 80s, it would have been a major mistake to go into just about every single engineering field. I mean, nuclear engineering, aeroastro engineering, those were already, people knew those were pretty bad. Chemical engineering, mechanical engineering, anything that actually involved building things, changing the world, turned out to be sort of a dead-end career. And so we had this sort of narrow cone of progress around bits, much less in atoms. And you could sort of summarize it that maybe we've built the Star Trek computer, but we don't have anything else from the Star Trek universe. We don't have, we certainly don't have warp drive. We don't even have the Concorde anymore. We don't have sort of the matter transporter technology that can rearrange matter and create sort of cornucopia. And instead, we've sort of experienced a few decades of relative stagnation, where for the first time in the history of the United States, the younger generation is finding it to be quite a struggle to live up to the standards of their parents, of the baby boomers, and people who came before them. And this is a sort of a shocking disconnect. It is, it's Silicon Valley is sort of a very insular place. This is sort of only barely started to dawn. It's something I've been on a crusade about for probably the better part of a decade. We sort of wrote a manifesto in 2011 where we sort of summarized this by saying, we were promised flying cars and all we got was 140 characters, which is not meant to be a critique of Twitter or of specific Silicon Valley companies. I think as companies they do quite well, but they are not proxies for the whole. They do not stand for the sort of progress of the whole. And I think that even with all its sort of campus-like insularity, one can say that in 2019, Silicon Valley is getting a little bit of a bad conscience. It sort of it has gotten a sense that there's a disconnect between its propaganda and reality. The Google propaganda isn't quite working anymore. They're not even talking about self-driving cars that much anymore. Somehow that sort of has faded a bit. Now I think it's still very preliminary. The bad conscience hasn't, it's mostly sort of manifesting in insane left-wing politics, sort of I think almost of a self-hating variety. Sort of a random factoid as of June, about a month ago, I was looking at this last. The single candidate that Google employees are donating more to in the presidential cycle than anybody else is Elizabeth Warren, which is sort of like a bad conscience that's sort of directed in a semi-masochistic way, but has not yet led to some of the sort of introspection that one might want, or that might help us push in a different direction. Let me sort of suggest one particular line where this should go, and this is not the only one, but it's one that's sort of shocking and glaring in how disconnected it is from the national interest. So let's take Google at its word. It is building the Star Trek computer. It is building this artificial general intelligence in the form of the DeepMind effort that they have at Google. Is this a military weapon? AI is presumably at least a dual-use weapon, and we've been a lot more dishonest about that in Silicon Valley than the nuclear physicists were in the 1940s. There was a real debate between Teller and Oppenheimer. We've not had any debate about this whatsoever. But I think there are some questions that we should be asking. And from a national US perspective, let me suggest the following three questions that should be asked of Google. Number one, how many foreign intelligence agencies have infiltrated your Manhattan Project for AI? Number two, does Google's senior management consider itself to have been thoroughly infiltrated by Chinese intelligence? Number three, is it because they consider themselves to be so thoroughly infiltrated that they've engaged in this seemingly treasonous decision to work with the Chinese military and not with the US military? Because they figure that if the technology because they are making the sort of bad short-term rationalistic calculation that if the technology doesn't go out the front door, it'll get stolen out the back door anyway. Now, I think whatever bad conscience they have, they are not asking these questions. They're not about to answer them. I think the questions need to be asked on a federal level of the United States. They need to be asked by the FBI, by the CIA, and I'm not sure quite how to put this, I would like them to be asked in a not excessively gentle manner. Let me mention sort of one other. There's so many aspects of the tech propaganda that I think we should push back on, but one other one that I always find sort of egregiously off is the story of runaway automation. That we're just going to automate away all the jobs. This is great. People will be put out to pasture. They'll get some universal basic income. Maybe they'll play video games in the basement. But we have this runaway automation, which of course doesn't show up in the unemployment rate in the U.S. It doesn't really show up in the productivity numbers. The fundamental thing that I think is going on in a way is that most of the jobs that could be automated were automated a long time ago, and our economies, most of the jobs that are left are weirdly immune to automation. So we have an economy that has like lots of yoga teachers and kindergarten instructors and nurses and waiters in restaurants whose jobs are not that different from what they were 50 or 100 years ago. And the real worry is that we're going to automate them far too slowly, and that we're going to have sort of be stuck with low productivity growth for decades to come. Now, I think this sort of narrative of runaway automation, though, plays an important deflecting role. And the way to sort of get at this is through a thought experiment. You sort of, even though I'm sort of pro-technology and pro-innovation, if you told me, we're going to build some robots that look just like you, they can do everything you do, they'll be smarter than you, they'll work for free. I'd actually, at that point, I would get a little bit nervous. Sort of like it's the reason people are nervous about cloning, not just the bioethics reasons, it's sort of the economic reason. If you have 100 people who are identical to you, you sort of get a sense this might not be that good for your wages. And so something like those robots in a technological context, that's somewhere between science fiction and science fiction fantasy. It's nowhere about to happen. But if you sort of transpose it, you can say that human beings who are treated like robots and paid very little, well, that's actually what's going on in India and China. And maybe this whole conversation about automation is just sort of a displaced way to talk about some of the problems of globalization. We tend to use technology and globalization synonymously, except when we differentiate them very sharply, when we end up turning technology into the scapegoat for the globalization problems we do not want to talk about. And this sort of brings me to the second big theme, which is the question of free trade. And I think this has been the signature achievement of the Trump administration, has been to reopen this question. And it is, of course, it is one where in theory, in a world of Ricardo and rational actors and everyone being treated the same, we should have free trade. Everyone will be better off. It all sort of makes sense. And yet, I think even if you look at this planet from outer space, you can tell that we are incredibly far from a functioning free trade regime. The U.S. exports $100 billion a year to China. We import $500 billion a year. And in a globalizing world, you'd expect convergence. You would expect the capital to flow to the higher growth regions. You would not expect Chinese peasants to be saving money to invest in low-yielding U.S. government bonds. And the fact that the money is flowing uphill tells you that something is insanely wrong with the entire trade picture. And it's probably massively overdetermined. It's not just that you have sort of weird restrictions on business and import restrictions in China and unfair double standards in taxation. You probably also have intellectual property theft, all sorts of cyber warfare directed against U.S. corporations. And then, there are probably, I think even from outer space, you could see that China is sort of an unusually dirty country that's dirtying up the whole planet. And maybe we should reframe the 25% tariffs as a carbon tax. It's a country where, and if we reframe it as a carbon tax on the country that's dirtying up the planet, maybe the 25% is a floor and not a ceiling. The one sort of very specific recommendation I would have on the free trade side is that the one general recommendation is that you don't want people negotiating trade treaties who dogmatically believe in free trade, because the worse they are at negotiating, the better a job they think they do. It's like it doesn't matter how much the other side rips us off. The more we get ripped off, the better a job we're doing. And we're sort of. We should know things are off enough that we want people who are a little bit distrustful, who are a little bit skeptical, who don't have John Lennon's Imagine playing in the background as they're negotiating a trade treaty or anything like that. There's a specific problem of political economy that I think is quite severe in the United States, and it's sort of generally true of the Anglosphere. And you can always, there's always sort of parts of the country that stand for the whole. The 1950s version of this was that there was sort of a GM executive said, what's good for General Motors is good for America. Not precisely correct, but it was approximately correct. And there certainly are some companies that stand for the whole. One case where this is definitely not the case that I want to underscore is I think money center banks do not stand, they are orthogonal. They're negatively correlated to the interests of the United States when it comes to trade. And the way to articulate this is as a very straightforward accounting identity. If you have a current account deficit, you need to sterilize the current account deficit with capital inflows into the US. The bigger the capital inflows go through the money center banking system. The bigger the flows, the more profits the banks make. And there's a long history one could go into on this, but the biggest current account deficits the United States had were in 2006, 2007. They were around 800 billion, roughly 6% of GDP. And the sort of role of the money center banks was to sterilize these deficits by concocting $800 billion worth of lies about how great the money could be invested in subprime real estate and all these sorts of things. And every time the current account deficit comes down in the US, we have a banking crisis. We had one from 87 to 91 when the deficit went from -3.5 to 0, and you had 2,000 S&Ls go broke and Michael Milken went to jail. We had it again from 06 to 09 when it went from -6 to -3. We stayed at -3 for the last decade. And what obviously has to happen is the current account deficit should go from -3 to 0. What a byproduct of that happening is that we are going to have a banking crisis, and at best we can have a sort of a controlled crash landing for the banks. And so my one very specific recommendation is that we know that anybody who works at a Wall Street bank will fight tooth and nail against any sort of sensible trade policy, and we need to keep them away from the negotiating table. I'm not against the banks categorically, but the over-financialized economy that we have in U.S. as well as other Anglosphere countries is not doing us any good on this.
For getting into the room, good evening. We will see you in the morning.